Hi, welcome to my video today on tips for how to glaze a teapot and what makes a teapot different to glaze than, let's say, a cup or a bowl or a plate, because there are some differences that make a difference when you're glazing. The biggest difference is that you have this spout, so you have two openings. You have one at the top and then the opening of the spout. So if you were glazing a cup, you would, or a bowl, you would glaze the interior first, right? So you would pour your glaze into the top opening, and then you would pour the glaze out, kind of turning it to get it glazed all the way around the interior wall. So with a teapot, what you have to do is keep a gloved finger, wear your glove, and as you would do the same thing in terms of filling it about 2/3 full, but I would keep a finger over the spout hole, so that when you're pouring the excess out and rotating it, you're keeping your finger kind of plugged. So the glaze is getting all the way up inside your spout. Once you feel it, it's after just a few seconds, then you can kind of release your finger from the spout and let all the glaze kind of run kind of out of the spout and out of the opening. Now when you're doing that, of course you're being really careful not to get glaze on the exterior of the teapot, because you want to glaze that kind of independently. So what you would do first, before you even pour the glaze inside, is kind of make sure that you've put wax resist, and that's this material right here, right, which is kind of a latex-based air drying kind of wax. Use a separate brush. Don't ever use a glaze brush for wax resist. I usually just use this little flat, and I mark it. I always keep this separated just for my wax resist application. And where do I apply it? Now, this is very, very important, because you don't want your lid to stick. And we always glaze our lids on the pots for shrinkage. We want to make sure that things fit in the end. So I usually sit my lid, right, carefully, right, on top of my teapot, and I make a light line all the way around the outer edge of my lid. And then I can remove it. So I know exactly where my lid is making contact with the top of the opening, the top edge. And that's where I would carefully brush apply a real thin layer of wax resist. Now, if my lid at the top has a little kind of flange that drops down like this one, I also want to make sure that I apply wax to that edge and to there. So everything between kind of this point and this point, I want to make sure I've covered in wax kind of all the way around, right? So any part that's making contact, right, there's the wax. So glaze does not adhere to that, and it'll end up being just kind of unglazed clay, and you won't have any kind of sticking issues. Once you've waxed it and let it dry, then you start the glazing process, right? That all happens prior. And also do the waxing of the foot, right? Or just be really careful, right? Make that pencil line, right? That trick that I like to share is when you put your piece down flat and lay a pencil flat and run it around the outer wall like that, right? You make that perfect level line, and you're very, very careful when you're applying your glaze, right, not to apply above that line or onto the foot. Keep that clean, only glaze kind of on the outer wall. So after you've glazed the interior, like I mentioned, holding your finger on the spout, pouring all the excess out, then you brush apply. If you don't have a large volume of glaze where you can kind of dip your pot upside down in the volume of glaze, then you would use a brush, right? And with a clear glaze application, brush application seems to work quite well. So use this 1-inch flat Hake brush. Really great for overall application. I tend to kind of like apply upside down so that if my glaze runs and flows, which you want it to, you just follow the drips and you try to do as few brush strokes, keep the brush strokes as smooth as possible, so that you're not building up multiple layers and overlapping brush strokes. So just fluid strokes, as few as possible to get all the total coverage. When it comes to handles, sometimes those are tricky to brush apply. That's when you might want to use this sumi brush because it allows you to get inside tight places, like inside the handle edges to apply your glaze. But for just general coverage, that Hake brush tends to do a really good job. And remember, you know, the glaze should be kind of a nice creamy consistency. You know, with clear glaze, one really generous coat tends to work well. Sometimes building up 2-3 coats of clear can lead to kind of a milky, cloudy quality. And if you have an underglaze design, you might obscure that a little bit with too heavy of an application. So as long as it's not watery, thin in consistency, usually one good generous coating gives you a nice, smooth, shiny surface when it comes to clear. That's only when it comes to clear. Usually glazes with color in them require a thicker application, especially with brush application, and you need to do 3 to 4 flowing coats with a brush, as opposed to kind of like a nice kind of slow dip inside, which is a much thicker application. So I hope these tips help out. And remember, we keep the lid after we've glazed the lid and glazed the teapot inside and out. We put the lid back on, right? If there's any glaze that beads up on top of your wax, right, when you're brushing it on, take a damp sponge, just a small sponge and a little bit of water, wring it out, and just wipe that beaded up glaze off, because even a bead of glaze sitting between 2 pieces, once the wax burns out, it'll still be there and it'll still melt and fuse those 2 pieces together. So you do need to wipe away any glaze, because sometimes that does happen where it sits kind of on top of the wax. So a damp sponge when the glaze is wet, faster to get rid of it than once it dries and it takes a little bit more effort to wipe it clean. Okay, I hope you enjoyed these tips on glazing a teapot, and good luck.